Wow, that's so cool.
It is. So you've gone over some of those terms with the dog or no?
Yeah. So cute though.
Whoa. Sorry, buddy.
Oh.
Nares, or nasal, nostril. That's the term they want to use. Like nostril.
Wait. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're in respiratory. So nostril is the external opening. So what's the whole chunk here?
Nasal cavity.
Good. What would be these structures inside the nasal cavity?
Is that your
There's a dorsal one and a ventral. Turbinates, yep. Conchae. So they have two sets. They have a dorsal and ventral turbinates, and these are our bones. They're covered with a pretty thick epithelium, but they're actually black here because they're full of blood. They're really highly vascular structures. So we think the purpose of these turbinates is to actually warm the air that they breathe in. So as the air flows over these and it's full of blood, a lot of blood flow going it actually warms the air before they inhale it. So I think that's the reason for them. But these are bones. They are bony structures. So these turbinates do bleed. That's why when we tube a horse, we don't want to be too rough to create a bloody nose, and we want to push the tube into this ventral nasal meatus, because that's going to go right then into the pharynx. If we get it in this middle nasal meatus, we go up and bump these ethmoid turbinates, which bleed like a son of a... So you got the dorsal and ventral turbinates, which divide the nasal cavity into two compartments. So you've got, which are called your meatus. So what would the middle one be called? Nasal meatus, yep, between the two. And the dorsal nasal meatus, as opposed to the ventral nasal meatus. So meatus is just a region, it's not any structure. So if they stuck a tag in, these two structures and said, what are these two structures? You'd say dorsal turbinate, ventral nasal turbinate. The structure between them is the middle nasal meatus. And then on this one you can see a nice cartilaginous septum. So it's dividing your left and right halves. So this is the nasal septum. So that's just going to divide your two halves. And you can see on this one, if there was a septum here, see how those turbinate bones are a little bit recessed? So if we had a septum here, there'd be a little space right next to the septum. So that space right next to the septum that's going to be free top to bottom, that's your common nasal meatus.
That's the what? Where is that again?
It's going to be, if your septum was here, there's a little space between the septum and these turbinate bones. So this space here is going to be called your common nasal meatus, because it can reach all three sites. That makes sense. So now we're going to exit the nose. So they want you to think of this one as the caudal nares. So we're exiting the nose, so it's the back opening. It's going to open from the nasal cavity into our pharynx. So if we think of exiting the nose, exiting the mouth, everything from the nose and mouth before it gets to our trachea and esophagus, that's the pharynx. So this whole region is going to be pharynx. And they don't want you to, they're not making you learn the regions of the pharynx, but I'll explain them just because I think it makes it easier to visualize. Because this soft palate, we got the hard palate at the top of our mouth, and then in the back of the mouth is this soft palate, and it separates our oral pharynx. So as we leave the mouth, we have this oral pharynx, and then we have our nasopharynx, as we leave our nose, and this soft palate separates those. So that's why a horse can't breathe through his mouth. If we try to take in air, there's no way for that air to reach our trachea. But there's a nice path from our nasal pharynx right into our larynx, into our trachea, to our lungs. So, so how does food, reach? Air goes this way. Food's got to cross and get into our esophagus. Here's our esophagus. It's been cut away, but it lies basically on top of the trachea. So when a horse or anybody swallows, this epiglottis, this is part of our larynx. This whole region here is larynx. It's made up of different cartilages, and they've got different terms for those, but I think we're going to wait till next week because you're going to cut the larynx out of your dog and you'll be able to see him better. But this region here is your larynx, and this epiglottis is the big flap. That's the cover to our airway. So when we swallow, this thing slams shut, so food or water can go through our oral pharynx right into our esophagus. So that's a pretty big deal, pretty important deal. That's why you can't really, talk and swallow at the same time. You gotta shut off your airway in order to get food into your esophagus. So this larynx, it has a lot of important structures. Our little vocal cord, you can see this little vocal fold here. We'll go over some of that next week, but that's giving you voice, gives us tone, pitch, and the larynx is full of these muscles that change the shape, allow us to, change our pitch and give us, sound. So that's big in a horse. Anybody heard the term roar? Okay, we won't worry about that then. Yeah, that's an aside. How about auditory tube? That's on our list, right? So the auditory tube, there's a little opening in the back of our nasopharynx. There's a little flap here. And this flap opens to a tube that runs from your pharynx to your ear. It's called the auditory tube or Eustachian tube. And if you're in an airplane or in a car going up and down, how your ears pop, that's the pressure change that's adjusting, and that's going on in your auditory tube. So the horse has a pretty unique diverticulum in that auditory tube called the guttural pouch. So it's this big cavity here just below the brain in the horse. This is called the guttural pouch. And there's, some theory it's pretty unique to the horse. Our other species don't have it. We wonder kind of why. But one theory is that our internal carotid artery here passes through this guttural pouch on the way to the brain. So some think that we want to cool that blood by circulating air around it before it goes to the brain. So that's one theory. The downside of that guttural pouch is it will get infected occasionally. And here is this retropharyngeal lymph node, and it's not on your list, but maybe some of you have heard of strangles or are aware of that. Well, this is the lymph node that usually gets infected with that strep equi. So it'll go from this size to, a softball size. So you can imagine, one, putting pressure on our pharynx, cutting off the airway. That's why I think the term strangles comes from. They just basically run out of air because they have occluded the airway. But it also lies real close to this guttural pouch, so we'll get sometimes infection in this guttural pouch from that strangles disease. And it's real hard to treat because there's no blood supply in there. We can give them antibiotics, but it's tough to get it in there, so most of the time we end up treating them through this flap and going in there. So that's just kind of another fun fact to know. What other terms are we missing? Mouth, got that. Yep.
Did you do cricoid cartilage already?
We're going to go over those next week, I think. So those are
okay.
part of the larynx. So I think just know that all this cartilage here in our opening to the trachea, that's the larynx. And we'll learn different parts next week.
Okay.
Did you say where the dorsal turbinate?
Dorsal turbinates, yeah. These,
That was just that one that was up
yeah, dorsal
Oh, okay.
turbinates and ventral turbinates. Yeah.